And US President Donald Trump says discussions to end the war in Ukraine are very much on track following his talks with Vladimir Putin yesterday and with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky today. In fact, we've just heard that Mr. Zelensky has said he would like Donald Trump to visit Ukraine. He believes that would be helpful for Mr. Trump in his peace efforts. But as negotiations continue, so too does the fighting. Air raid sirens blared across Ukraine today, including in the capital, Kyiv, within hours of an agreement to stop attacks on energy infrastructure. Well, President Zelensky says he is optimistic of a lasting peace, but will Russia's demands make a deal possible? Well, with me to discuss all of that is our resident security analyst, former strategic military planner and assault helicopter pilot in the British military, and the host of Security Brief, Mikey Kay. And just a reminder, Mikey will deliver this brief over the next few minutes, as he would do to his generals. So let's start off then, Mikey, with how you see the developments of the last few days.
Well, I mean, the first thing I'll add, Ben, is I think the Vice President J.D. Vance would also probably benefit from a visit to Ukraine, given the conversations that went on in the Oval Office with Zelensky not so long ago. The headlines basically from yesterday, Ben, was the cessation of strikes on energy infrastructure by both sides. That was the proposed agreement. In addition, what was sort of attached to that was a 175 prisoner of war exchange that actually went ahead today, as we can see on the screens there. And then the other thing, which was a little bit left of field, if you ask me, was negotiations concerning shipping in the Black Sea. Why is that important to Putin, you may ask? Well, if we can go to a slide of Crimea and the Black Sea, you'll see it. Basically, we have the Black Sea there, we have Crimea at the top of the screen. Bottom left-hand corner is the Bosphorus Strait. Bosphorus Strait, as you know, 19 miles long, no longer than 2.3 miles wide. But this is critical, not only for commercial shipping from Russia, but for Russian force projection. And it allows Russia's Navy to get out of the Bosphorus Strait into the Mediterranean. If it wishes to proceed west, it can go into the Atlantic. If it wishes to proceed south, it can go through the Suez into the Indian Ocean. So effectively, you can see why this was a demand or something that was put by Putin into the mix for that ceasefire. But in all of this, Zelensky's response has been, quote, Putin's words are very different from reality. So there's a lot of insecurity there, and rightly so, from Zelensky. Both drone attacks overnight, we know there have been drone attacks, have been committed on both sides. This is after the deal was announced, after the Trump-Putin phone call. Zelensky saying that Russia launched 150 drones, including 45 on the region of the capital, Kyiv, and also a hospital in Sumy, just near the Russian border, near Kharkiv. And then obviously Ukraine, well not obviously, but Ukraine has obviously hit targets, including an oil refinery in Krasnodar, Russia. That Krasnodar is well to the east of Crimea, deep in Russian territory. Now, one thing that's interesting today is we've got Witkoff, who is Trump's special envoy, after a phone call by Putin to the Oval Office, apparently defending Putin, saying that the attacks by Russia on Ukraine last night would have occurred before the order was given by Putin. It's quite remarkable this is coming out from an envoy from the US. And Witkoff then went on to say that 7 of those drones that were launched were actually shot down by Russian forces. So believe of that, Ben, what you will. Zelensky, after the call with Trump today, also said that he will stop strikes on Russian energy infrastructure. So that seems to have gotten through. And as was mentioned by you earlier on, Trump's also asked for assistance on US-made Patriot missile systems. Trump's response to that was he would try to find US-made Patriot missile systems inside Europe. So that's the military activity overnight, a lot going on. So basically the headline is, within 1 hour of this agreement being made after the phone call, the proposed partial ceasefire was broken or breached.
A lot of people have said that actually Putin made a few concessions, if you like, but actually made more demands than concessions. What else did he talk about on that call with Donald Trump?
I'm struggling to see where the concessions are, if I'm honest. What I'm seeing is a lot of demands, and there were a lot of demands, but they were likely to a complete cessation of hostilities, obviously without any form of timeline. If we can go to slide, please, we'll look at the bullets. Basically, What came out of that call was no foreign military aid to Ukraine, no foreign intelligence sharing to Ukraine, and to no mobilization and rearmament of armed forces of Ukraine. Now, in addition to that, which wasn't on the readout, Ben, however, that doesn't mean it wasn't discussed, and as Putin has outlined before, this takes us into the mindset of Putin and Russia. If we can go to a slide on the other two that I think are important, are the 4 annexed regions, plus Crimea, which is 5, and no pathway for Ukraine joining NATO. Now, I think it's important now just to give a reminder to the viewers on those 4 annexed regions. If we can go to a slide, please, of the annexed regions, and we've seen this before, we've presented this before many times on the security brief. These are regions that are either partially occupied or fully occupied by Russia since the invasion in 2022. You've got Luhansk at the top, Donetsk, and then down towards the bottom left of the screen, you've got Zaporizhzhia, and we'll talk about Zaporizhzhia later and the importance of that, and you've got Kherson. Now, these demands, and this is about getting into the mindset of Putin and what European leaders are talking about. These demands haven't changed since 2021. In 2021, Lavrov came to Switzerland and presented Antony Blinken, Secretary of State at the time, with demands on Ukraine, such as capping the military, no increase in size of the military, caps on military capability. And then you've got the 2022 Istanbul, what were called protocols, but are actually demands, which are more on NATO. Article 4 and Article 6 inside that protocol basically said no expansion of NATO. We've seen a breach of that with Sweden and Finland, and no increase of NATO forces inside Europe. So, so that is the mindset. But one thing I want to go into here is we don't talk about Crimea much these days, which was annexed by Putin in 2014. And just a reminder of the military significance of Crimea. If we can go to slide, please. I think we've got a... So this is the Crimean Peninsula. And what you can see on there is those logos, if you like, or those bits are indicating air bases and also indicating, excuse me, naval installations. Now, there are 60 naval installations on the island of Crimea, and there are 24 air bases. And just to put it into perspective, Crimea is only ever so slightly bigger than Wales. So it's a significant militarized zone. Now, if we zoom into the bottom southwest of the peninsula, this is an area called Sebastopol. And you can just look at that graphic and see the significant amount of Russian naval assets in that area, which goes back to the conversation earlier on about Russian naval force projection into the Black Sea and then out towards the Mediterranean, giving them global sea lines communication.
So the White House, the Kremlin really said that yesterday's phone call was a step towards peace. In fact, we heard from the White House press secretary today saying we've never been this close to peace. Huge sort of optimism, certainly from the White House. Is that in any way, we probably just answered that, but really, is that in any way justified? Yeah, well, we touched upon it, but I think we can go into it in a bit more detail. You know, UK drones since the beginning of 2025 have knocked out around 10% of Russia's refining capability. Let's just go slide, please, and we can take a look at just the damage that's been done. I don't think we can quite see on that, but basically the really dark area is Crimea. And BBC analysis found that Ukraine had struck Russian oil targets 81 times in 2024. The map you can see shows the volume. So darkest red is the most attacks, which is Crimea, which is obviously closest to the Ukrainian border. And then all over that part of Russia, you can see strikes. Now, according to data from Reuters, if you also factor in that Russia's Gazprom is also reporting a $13.1 billion loss in 2024, according to the Moscow Times, then you might get a sense that Russia's energy supply could be considerably vulnerable to all of this. Hence, going back to stop striking the energy infrastructure targets, which was a demand placed on Putin. On the Ukrainian side, though, they have also, so their losses since 2022, 14.6 billion of infrastructure has been destroyed. And in September 2024, Zelensky came out and said that 80% of Ukraine energy infrastructure had been destroyed by Russia. Now, in all of these conversations, we've not really touched upon the nuclear power plant bit. Now, obviously, Chernobyl is the infamous one. But last month, a Russian drone hit the protective radiation shield at Chernobyl. The Russians obviously denied it. But Europe's largest nuclear power plant, as you know, is inside Ukraine. And it has been central to the ceasefire talks. Trump's been talking about this. We were talking about this earlier on today. So what's its significance?
The nuclear power plant is in a region called Zaporizhzhia. If we can go slide, please. We spoke about Zaporizhzhia being one of those occupied regions by Putin. But it's now in an area which Russia controls. So in 2021, before the war started in Zaporizhzhia, that nuclear power plant provided Ukraine 23% of its energy consumption. 23%. That's incredibly critical to Ukraine. It was seized by Russian forces in March 2022 after the invasion, and then it was shut down in September 22, citing obviously dangers and risk from fighting. Now, the other reason why Trump is now talking about this is because that in order for the US to move forward on that minerals deal that we've heard so much about, there are significant minerals in the Zaporizhzhia region, and the nuclear power plant there has been highlighted as a critical capability in order to give power to those manufacturing companies from the US to go in and actually extract those minerals from the ground. That's the relevance of that nuclear power plant, the largest one in Europe, inside Zaporizhzhia.
Let's just talk a bit about the offensive that we saw from Ukraine when they went into Kursk, and they made a lot of progress. They were hoping to use it as a sort of bargaining chip in any negotiations with Russia. They've then faced a huge counterattack by the Russians. Where are we with that? Because that could be absolutely key if we do get proper talks underway in the future between Ukraine and Russia.
Yeah, September 2024 last year was when armed forces of Ukraine crossed the border and started to try and occupy that bit of territory. That territory has decreased from September 24 by over 50%. So the Russians have made significant territory back. But one thing's important about this, Ben, is that we haven't really been speaking about over the last month or week since the negotiations started, is that as we were talking about, all the demands are coming from Putin onto Zelensky about not having NATO forces or foreign aid inside Ukraine. But no one's talking about the North Korean troops that Russia and Putin has invited. And that's the reason why Russia has managed to get a lot of that territory back, is because there are still over 10,000 North Korean soldiers in that area which are fighting against the armed forces of Ukraine in order to try and get that territory back. And I also think that, and if we can go to slide, if we've not done so already, of the Kursk region, you can see basically the blue areas where the armed forces of Ukraine are, and you've got the red area around that. Now, Trump came out the other day and basically said that he saved Ukrainian soldiers and prevented them from being encircled, but there is no evidence whatsoever to suggest that that was actually the case. Are Ukrainian forces withdrawing from there? They are. Is Kursk on the books as a negotiating tool? Probably not.
OK, certainly the Russians have been throwing manpower at that. Mikey, for the moment, thank you very much indeed. Much more coming up on the security brief, but we'll just take a quick break. Around the world and across the UK, you're watching BBC News. Welcome back. You're watching BBC News, and we are presenting you with the security brief with our resident security analyst, former strategic military planner and assault helicopter pilot in the British military, Mikey Kay. And we're going to continue talking about the negotiations, such as they are, to reach a ceasefire in Ukraine. And we're going to bring in now Tobias Ellwood, former UK Minister of Defence, who is very kindly joining us on the programme. Tobias Ellwood, thank you so much for being with us. Let's just start off with a general reaction to the talks or the phone calls that we've had yesterday between Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin, which we were just discussing. Mr. Putin didn't seem to make too many concessions. And then we've had the debrief of that between Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky today. Certainly the two of them seem to be on rather better terms than they were in the White House a few weeks ago. What do you make of all of that? Where are we? The White House saying we've never been this close to peace. Do you agree with that?
Well, I know I don't agree with that. We're ever further away from peace. And every day we have these new announcements. But when we reflect back, it all started at the Munich Security Conference. I was there when Vice President Vance addressed European leaders and telling them Europe's threat was from within rather than Russia. And there's been this steady drumbeat of concerning messaging from the White House that suggests a fundamental recalibration, if you like, in the transatlantic relationship. And this has been echoed in the readouts from that phone call that you make reference to between Trump and Putin, which suggests Trump is more focused in repairing America's relationship with Russia than it is helping Ukraine. And this is all game-changing for Europe. To see our closest security ally that Europe has relied on for stability, that we stood shoulder to shoulder with for decades, now team up with Europe's biggest threat. And it's this new reality that's led the British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, to promote the formation of this coalition of the willing that will be meeting very shortly to consider how we move forward, but potentially without the United States, given the Russian threat will continue to persist.
Tobias, it's Mikey here. I want to pick up on the European perspective. You mentioned Keir Starmer. One thing that's fascinated me over the weeks is this idea of a European peacekeeping force. And the bit I can't get my head around is that given Putin's mindset, given the fact that all the demands he has made has meant no foreign military aid, no foreign military forces inside Ukraine, no increase of NATO inside Europe, no expansion of NATO. Or can you give me an insight into why the Europeans think this might be plausible, and where would this peacekeeping force go? Is it Poland? Is it the Baltic states?
No, you're right to ask these very, very difficult questions, but we're seeing this plan A that was promoted by Trump and Putin take us down a road of appeasement, in my view, that will not provide the security guarantees that Ukraine requires, that will not halt Russia's intentions of not only securing all of Ukraine, but going beyond that. And that's why countries have recognized that we need to do more, invest in our own defense, and certainly Germany is doing that, France, now Britain as well. But the mission itself, yes, can it be achieved without US support? What will be the size, its composition of the force, the rules of engagement? Where would the line of separation fall on the map? There would have to be a no-fly zone. There would have to be a maritime component as well. Some very difficult questions operationally, but also long-term as well. Part of this conversation the Prime Minister, I believe, is having is actually with the British people, as other leaders in Europe is having as well, is to say that we've entered a new era of insecurity, and we've got to recognize where this is going. So the answers won't come tomorrow, absolutely not. What this is saying, as a nation, we need to prepare for very, very difficult times ahead that will require more investment in defense, but also doing some heavy lifting in Ukraine, because the consequence of us not doing this would be huge, because it will simply give Russia the time and space to rearm and regroup and advance Putin's own ambitions.
Tobias, you make a really good point on ROE, rules of engagement. And what's always fascinated me is, having worked as a UN military observer, you need a framework which will define rules of engagement. The frameworks that we're familiar with are NATO Article 5, collective self-defense. That's a non-starter, I would imagine. And then you've got Chapter 6, Chapter 7, UN peacekeeping operations, Chapter 6 being benign without the use of force, Chapter 7, obviously both have to be approved by the Security Council, which I don't see happening. So, I mean, even if there was a conversation of a peacekeeping force, capability-wise, I would assume it's the Allied Rapid Reaction Corps, which are the strategic reserve of Europe. But what other framework is there that they would operate under in terms of rules of engagement?
Yeah, another big question there. And it can't be under the NATO remit, if you like, because America, the United States, has ruled this out. They are not wanting to put troops there. Curious, and I have sort of flashbacks of what Donald Trump did with Afghanistan in sending his team to Doha, if you remember, in 2020, signing a deal with the Taliban, but saying America is not going to have anything to do with the post plan there, and stepping back, leaving everybody else to pick up the pieces. And here we have him again, signing a deal or promoting a deal with the adversary, but not including either Europe or indeed Ukraine as well. So difficult questions. You're quite right to pose this. Everything's upside down here. Ceasefires are normally unconditional, where opposing factions are actually war-weary, ready to sort of sit down and have the conversation. But neither Ukraine nor Russia are at that point. And this won't be a peacekeeping force. I've done, I'm sure you have as well, whether it be Bosnia or elsewhere. But what you want is to get people around the table to discuss what will happen next. This isn't peacekeeping. This is supporting one side. Yeah. This is actually preventing Russia from invading or advancing any further. So this idea that it's peacekeeping, it's a stabilization and what's a shame, I have to say, is why didn't we have this grit, this tenacity, this determination to do this 2 years ago? We'd be in a very different place.
Tobias, last question. You mentioned defence spending in Europe. Do you think, and we've heard from the Germans about spending more. I was interviewing tonight the Polish finance minister who's here in London, and they're talking about raising their defence spending to 4.7% of their GDP. Do you think that European nations are now waking up to the threat from Russia, but also, if you like, the disengagement of the United States from Europe?
Yes, I mean, this is the sad reality here, is that we do need to upgrade our defence posture, and it will take time to do that, take time. And it isn't just in the traditional forms of warfare, it's in the grey zone as well. Not a day goes by when Russia is not attacking us from a cyber perspective, or there's coercion, disinformation campaigns, or clipping of those undersea cables and so forth. There's an entire world there where we're extremely vulnerable indeed. We need to take the British public with us. That's so important, and recognize that there is a symbiotic relationship between our economy and our security. Unless we actually bolster up our security, our economy will be affected. But I stress, let's take the British people with us. Let's explain what's coming over the hill. And then there'll be more of a, I think, pressure on MPs to say, absolutely, find the money, even if it includes, raising taxes to some degree. That's what needs to happen now.
Tobias, really good to have you on the programme. Thanks so much for being with us. Tobias Ellwood there.
Thank you.
So, Mikey, what's your assessment? Where does all this leave us?
Well, I mean, Tobias was starting to go into, the consequences of Trump's alignment with Putin in terms of where Europe are posturing. There are lots, and they are building. We can start with the Ottawa Treaty, which was basically instigated in 1997. You had 160 countries signing the treaty, which was preventing the use of landmines. The UK was a signatory of that in 1997. I have to say that US, Russia, and China were not. So now we have Poland and the Baltic states withdrawing from that treaty, citing that landmines would actually be critical to prevention of Ukraine aggression. So the consequences of Putin's actions on conventions that have stood 1997. And then basically we are going into other unintended consequences. We heard about the F-35 fighter jet, US produced. I think we've got a slide of what this looks like, a fifth generation fighter. Absolutely the fighter of the moment. But, recently we've had Canada's Carney order a review on the $13.29 billion contract for 88 F-35 fighters jets from Lockheed Martin, saying Canada is too reliant on the US. Turkey, which was excluded from purchasing the F-35 when it bought Russian S-400s anti-aircraft missiles in 2022. Turkey then started to look towards Europe and the Typhoon fighter. Typhoon is a joint project by UK, Italy, Germany and Spain. But the Germans then opposed that because they thought the Turks might use them against Syrian Kurdish forces. But now in November 2024, the Germans have effectively said, you know what, Typhoons are on the block again. So we've now got Turkey looking towards Europe for the Typhoon. When it comes to Germany again, Germany has voted for a historic boost in defence spending. The law that they've just passed will exempt spending on defence and security from Germany's strict debt rules. So they've just announced a $547 billion infrastructure fund. Today, you alluded to the European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen. She announced an €800 billion fund focused on critical capabilities of Europe and also 2030. So there's lots.
OK, Mikey, we've been talking about the current conflict in Europe, in Ukraine, but we're constantly reminded about the war that ended 80 years ago, World War II. And we've had this week the death of the last surviving Battle of Britain pilot at the age of 105.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be remiss not to mention Group Captain Paddy Hemingway, the last of the few, that few being coined by Winston Churchill, an incredible, remarkable fighter pilot. He was the very last one that fought in the Battle of France and the Battle of Britain. And the inimitable words of Winston Churchill, never in the field of human conflict was so much been owed to so many by so few. A statement that in terms of the defence of the UK sovereignty is as true today as it was back then 85 years ago.
Yeah. Very good of you to mention Paddy. What an extraordinary hero. Mikey, thank you very much indeed. Mikey Kay with the Security Brief. You've been watching BBC News. Do stay tuned.